Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm Hallie Tecco.
I'm Michael Esquivel.
And I'm Steve Kraus. And every Monday, we bring you the latest in healthcare innovation as we sit down with entrepreneurs and industry experts.
So buckle up and join us as we figure out how to improve healthcare for all.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I am Steve Kraus, and today I'm talking to Katherine Stueland, the president and CEO of GeneDx, one of the fastest growing and hottest stocks in the very important healthcare sector of genomics and genetic testing. This is a space that we haven't delved into a lot on Heart of the Healthcare, so I am super excited to do so today. Katherine, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we're not a finance investment podcast. We are a healthcare podcast, but it is pretty notable that I read that GeneDx is leading the Russell 2000, which is a stock index for growth companies, with a incredible 1,000% plus growth in the stock price over the last year. So what makes GeneDx so special?
Absolutely. So GeneDx, we have a technology that is called exome and genome sequencing. What we do is we're able to take a genome's worth of information and distill it into a diagnosis for patients. And our area of focus today is really with children who are suffering from a rare disease. And there's a huge unmet need. These families actually go through what's called a diagnostic odyssey for, on average, 6 to 8 years.
Oh, wow.
And what we can do is provide a diagnosis within a matter of weeks, if not days. And so I think investors are really starting to realize we have the leading position. We're able to do something that's really hard to do. We're able to do it cost effectively. We're able to do it at scale. And ultimately what that means is we're able to help an ever growing number of patients and families to be able to get a diagnosis as quickly and as cost effectively as possible.
So as I mentioned, we haven't delved a lot into this space. So maybe we can start at genomics, genetics 101 for our listeners. You described exome sequencing, obviously whole genome sequencing, I think, is the holy grail. And then there's multi-gene panels. Can you just walk our listeners through how they should think about each of those, what they mean, and where your company has sort of progressed the field?
Absolutely. I think most people are familiar with, I'll call them the celebrity genes, thanks to Angelina Jolie, BRCA1 and BRCA2, which are commonly associated with hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. So if you think about those as kind of the starting point, a lot of genetic disease as it pertained to cancer really came to looking at one of those two genes. About 11 years ago in 2013, the Supreme Court made this historic decision that said that nobody could actually patent genes. Those genes had been patented by a company previously. And the Supreme Court decision meant that anyone could be able to take information that was within their own DNA and be able to really understand the breadth of genetic disease that may be burdening them or somebody in their families. So we went from looking at 1 to 2 genes for cancer to now there's about 100 genes that we know are associated with cancer.
So to use startup language, just to interrupt you, basically the Supreme Court said, this is not going to be a closed wall proprietary system where each company owns one gene and you gotta license it from it. It's almost like it's an open source universe. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it came down to some pretty sophisticated arguments that went in front of the Supreme Court, but the patient community was very vocal to say, it's my DNA. I should be able to choose what I want to have happen with it. And no company should own a gene and be able to do what they want with it. So that was a transformational decision that ultimately I think was on the side of patients, because where we're sitting today, you can now look at hundreds of genes. And in our case, we're looking at 20,000 genes. and we're able to say whether or not one of those genes is causing seizures or unexplained hearing loss, a child who's born without the ability to hear. And then what's happening on the other side of the healthcare ecosystem, all of these biotech companies are developing gene therapies, they're developing new therapeutics. So our goal is to be able to diagnose as quickly as possible and then be able to say, now that you have this diagnosis, there's clinical trials, there's FDA-approved therapies, there's other families like yours that you can connect with to really start to understand how to get a child and a family on a healthier path forward.
And so I think that the Supreme Court case took like the multi-gene panel, licensing genes from different companies, and then opened up the exome and whole genome sequencing realm. But like, can you explain the difference for our listeners in what an exome is and what a whole genome sequence is, and where are we today in sort of that spectrum of genetic testing capabilities?
Exactly. So we went from single gene testing to multi-gene panels. And then, as you said, the holy grail really is genome sequencing, which is looking at the entirety of your own DNA, which includes 20,000 genes. The precursor to that is what we call exome sequencing. And that's looking at the parts of the genome that are protein coding regions. And so these are the regions where we know there to be the vast majority of disease-causing genetic variants. So it's a pretty efficient way to be able to diagnose most of disease, but whole genome sequencing allows us to have the fully comprehensive view of your DNA. And that's where we want to ultimately get to as a company, as being able to diagnose disease based on that whole genome, and be able to do that at birth for every baby when they're born.
And is the journey that we have to travel between exome sequencing, which is what you guys are leaders in now, to whole genome sequencing, is it an issue of cost, time to results, lack of full information? What's the journey that the industry and you guys have to travel to get there?
The whole genome product that we have today is really good. I would say one of the things that we have to solve for is payers need to start paying for it, meaning insurance companies. Okay. So United Healthcare will pay for some genome sequencing, but they pay more commonly for exome sequencing.
And when do they? When does an insurance company pay for a whole new genome? So, like, what's the line they draw between doing a whole genome sequence and exome sequence?
Yeah, and I should say, state by state Medicaid programs are also paying for this. Yeah. Because I think that the governments are really seeing how important it is to get diagnosed. They're seeing the cost associated with not diagnosing disease and how detrimental that is for families state by state. But I think more data is showing that there is value in looking at the whole genome. There was a study that was published just a few months ago in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed, in rare disease in particular, 12% more information you're able to find in a genome than in an exome. So we're generating more and more data that is showing that the real value of being able to go to whole genome. Some of it does come down to our ability to do it cost effectively too. So, 5 years ago, it was probably more cost effective to look at those smaller gene panels, which is why there's so many of them out there. But thanks to companies like Illumina, PacBio, they're really helping drive down the cost of sequencing. Anyone can buy a sequencer, plug it in, and run somebody's DNA. But the interpretation of that information, that's really the hardest part of it. And what we're doing through our interpretation platform is continuing to drive down the cost of that as well. So that's where over the next 2 to 3 years, we feel like there will continue to be this shift, not just from multi-gene panels to whole exome, but also whole exome to whole genome sequencing.
And today, whether it be GeneDx cost or others on the market, like what is the delta between what a whole genome sequence costs and an exome test cost?
Yeah, so the average price for both today is about $2,800. We get paid about $2,800 from insurance companies for both of those services. So it's pretty much at parity. So it really comes down to ensuring that we can do it as quickly as possible. For instance, in the NICU, we actually do use whole genome sequencing for babies in the NICU. And we're able to turn around an answer within a number of days. And that's critically important to being able to diagnose disease and figure out how we might be able to put that baby on a healthier path sooner.
These are babies who present, you can tell us, a couple days, and there's the developmental delays even at that point, or some trigger, some sign that leads them, the parents, the clinician, to say, hey, we need to work with GeneDx or to get this underlying, try to understand what the underlying cause is.
Absolutely. So there's two settings where we provide our services. One is in the outpatient setting, and that's the vast majority of the work that we're doing is with children who are experiencing symptoms from epilepsy. So think about seizures. I mentioned hearing loss earlier, but also autism and symptoms related to autism. But in the NICU, it's really interesting that 1 in 4 babies in the NICU are likely to have a genetic disorder.
1 in 4?
However, 1 in 4.
Wow.
But very few are actually getting sequenced today. Only about 5% of babies in the NICU are being tested. What that means is, because we're not testing as much as we should be testing in the NICU, there's more and more children who then are growing up with these underlying genetic conditions.
And what are those conditions, just as an example, like that your tests are able to find?
There's been a lot of focus on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. That's a relevant example. I mentioned epilepsy. There's 768 genes associated with epilepsy, and a growing number of genes too. We actually make new gene disease discoveries and disease correlations routinely. So it's a whole host of conditions that are related. There's about 7,000 rare diseases that are out there, which makes it so complicated. This is part of the reason why it's important to really think about shifting the standard of care for babies who are in the NICU or for a child who has a symptom that is not explainable, and really just taking a comprehensive view up front, because it's really, really challenging if you think about those 7,000 rare diseases to try to pinpoint which gene or which sets of genes. We just want to be able to look at all of the genes that we're carrying and figure out exactly what the condition is.
Do you have a sense of how many patients that you guys diagnose that actually have a treatment?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I think in the case of epilepsy, once you're diagnosing a child with epilepsy, there's about a 90% reduction in seizures.
Oh, wow.
So part of what's really, I think, very hopeful for families, the FDA they're sitting on a number of new drug applications from different biotech companies. And they've actually said that they're preparing for a, quote, tsunami of new drug applications for children with rare diseases. And they want to make sure that there's a very clear pathway for reviewing the data that comes in and being able to approve drugs. So part of the reason why I think there's so much attention right now on rare disease and on GeneDx actually has to do with the broader ecosystem and the discoveries that are being made for investigational compounds that address these underlying genetic conditions.
I want to stick on some topic that we were just talking about, companion diagnostics. I mean, I was investing in diagnostics, I don't know, 15, 18 years ago. It was always like the holy grail, right? You couple a diagnostic with the treatment. Like, what's better than that? I don't think there are that many out there. I'm not an expert. I think that's a fair categorization. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if so, why is it taking so long?
It's not rare when you aggregate them. I think about rare diseases, I think about cancer. Cancer is actually a constellation of, a few thousand different conditions. So I think, though, the rare disease, genetic disease side of things is probably about a decade behind cancer. And part of the reason why if you're looking at these individual conditions, ultra rare diseases, there may be 10 patients total, right? The more common rare diseases have hundreds. And so a lot of companies historically, that the risk is really high and the cost of development is really high. Billions of dollars go into drug discovery and development. There's a 90% failure rate in R&D in our industry. I'm hopeful that AI can actually help us figure out how to solve that. There's a more clear regulatory pathway for them with FDA as well. Yeah.
You brought a topic up that I want to talk about. I mean, AI is all the hype across our entire world. It's actually the first time in healthcare I actually feel like our industry is one of the most ready to receive and swiftly act in implementing AI in making our industry better. And there's lots of places in healthcare where you can apply AI, but obviously genomics, genetics, the amount of data that is involved in those discoveries in this industry is just more than probably any other. And so I'm curious, as you sit as a leader of one of the most interesting companies in space, how do you think about AI and what it's going to do for your business and for the industry writ large?
In the genetic space, AI is actually a necessity. And
it's been used actually for a long time. People like the Whitehead and the Broad, I've always said, have been doing this for, it might not be generative AI, but they've been using AI machine learning models for probably decades right now.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's necessary, if for no other reason than the fact that there's only about 1,500 medical geneticists.
Interesting.
There are about 2,500 genetic counselors.
Wow.
And so if you think about the way that we're solving genetic disease today, and you think about where it can go, we're doing a study here in New York State where we're using whole genome sequencing on healthy newborns. So if you think about a future where we want to sequence everyone, doing population scale genetics, we have to figure out how to take that unique knowledge base of humans and be able to spread their expertise across an entire population of people. So we have, as an industry, we have a requirement, I think, to be able to hack that.
It's almost like a supply-demand imbalance, and you have to use AI to supplement the workforce, essentially, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. We happen to employ probably the biggest group of genetics experts at GeneDx. We've got about 150 genetics experts on our team. And the idea is, how do we make sure that we automate as much of the process from sample to report as possible? And then in the future, as we even think about that diagnosis of becoming a platform for what are the next steps, being able to automate that as well.
You mean actually partnering potentially with discovery development companies to actually produce drugs?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We've got the largest database of rare disease patients. So we have, when I started, we had sequenced about 270,000 clinical exomes and genomes. 3 years later, we're just hovering on 700,000. So we're rapidly contributing to our own data asset, which means more gene disease discoveries. I can't underscore how important the accuracy of interpretation is. A false positive, a false negative is not acceptable. And so the quality of interpretation is, it's one of the things that sets us apart. It's the reason that our database of 700,000 clinical exomes is so incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
For every patient that we're running, their data is informing the interpretation for the next patient.
Yeah.
And so that data repository is deeply valuable. And it's what sets us apart from other people who might plug in a sequencer and claim to be able to have an exome or a genome that's reliable.
Super great. So I want to talk a little bit, shift to you and the company you've built. you have a really interesting background because you're now a president CEO and you've had commercial roles at big companies in your space, but you started off in the communications and PR world. I saw you said in the past that the diagnostic industry is underappreciated. And I'm curious, given your background, what do you think the industry writ large needs to do to, from a marketing perspective, to make it more appreciated?
I think it's funny to think back on my career. I worked with a media trainer for many years who said, you can't treat it if you can't diagnose it. And that was her aim with every executive she worked with, was to give, to help them figure out exactly what they weren't doing effectively so they could communicate better. I think that what we have to do as an industry is work together to continue to bring the value of how important it is to diagnose a disease to the forefront. I think everyone experiences it, their own diagnostic odyssey. I remember when my dad was hospitalized for a cardiac condition. That's when we found out that he had Alzheimer's disease.
Wow, yeah.
And it took a long time. It took a lot of appointments. And it wasn't until he was in a cardiac intensive care unit when all of a sudden the attending physician said to me the next morning, he said, "How long has your dad had Alzheimer's disease?" And I was like, "He's never been formally diagnosed." And he said, "Well, unfortunately, the ICU is the worst place for a patient with Alzheimer's because it's so disorienting for them, all of the different noises." And I remember at that point in time just thinking, how amazing would it be just to be able to have, when we first started seeing my dad have symptoms, to be able to take some sort of genetic test to say, yes, there's a high likelihood that he has Alzheimer's disease, and be able to action that information.
And do you think that diagnosis is or the diagnostic industry is underappreciated because the technology hasn't been there, or is it a cultural issue where doctors are really meant to, trained to treat? What's the root cause of why the diagnostics have been underappreciated so far?
I think in part genetics was kind of the test of last resort. In medical school, that they're taking, one class, maybe two classes on genetics. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes this niche, the clinician of last resort that you want to go see. When the actual experience is a parent's going into a pediatrician, and how do we help arm the pediatrician then to be able to make sure that they can order the test as well. There is very much I think a human element of why clinicians and other providers aren't using the testing. What we talked about earlier, not having a good response to, okay, I just diagnosed your child with a devastating disease and there's nothing you can do with it.
Yeah.
What I can tell you though, having spent a lot of time with parents who have gone through this, yes, it's devastating. And then it's okay, at least now we know.
We know, yeah.
And for a lot of moms in particular, this is it's the secret that sometimes they will say out loud. But I've heard several of them talk about the fact that they feel a sense of relief because they carried a guilt that it was something that they had done. Yeah. And that's heartbreaking. Yeah, that's heartbreaking. So I think that there's a real push and pull of how do we get clinicians to break that patriarchal thinking. And I think that parents kind of demanding that they need the information to understand what's going on with their child is an important element of this as well.
I noted how you started off in communications, field marketing, not, I'd say, a traditional path to be a president CEO, although we did do a podcast a few months ago about the art of storytelling in healthcare, which is, art and storytelling in any leadership position is huge. But I'm curious, walk through your journey and if folks are in that field and thinking of aspiring to be a company leader, tell us about that. How'd you get there and what would be some of the lessons learned?
I studied English literature, so it's definitely an atypical path. However, I would say the ability to take complex information and distill it into something understandable is helpful, not just for storytelling, but in terms of problem solving.
Yeah.
And so, my very first assignment on the communication side of things, it was pivotal data on the first protease inhibitor for HIV and AIDS. And I called a patient advocacy group to share the data with them. And the person who I spoke to was so elated about the positive results. And they shared that not only were they an advocate, but they were a patient in the clinical trial.
Oh, wow.
And I went home that night and just felt this sense of I felt like I was a part of something really special, and being able to take scientific information and a breakthrough and be able to, I actually delivered it to a patient that day. And so that sense of human impact has been, for me, just with every career move that I've made, the central part of why I've made decisions in my career. But I think communicating is obviously super important, and being able to motivate people I would say equal weight is the ability to listen and really understand, as you're leading teams, as you're talking to investors, as you're talking to your customers, being able to really deeply listen and come back and be an advocate for them within your organization in order to really hone in on the right business problem, and then be able to address that with a very clear business solution.
Love that. Last thing I wanted to talk with you about is I actually was raised by a mother who was a corporate executive CEO, and she was a huge champion for women. And when I looked at your website, I noticed the majority of your executive team is women. And I'm wondering if that was purposeful, and what advice would you offer to other women leaders to make sure that we have more gender equality in the C-suite?
I'm happy to hear that your mom was one of the fearless people who stepped into that role. There was a headline a few years ago at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference that there were more biotech CEOs named Mike than there were women. And I remember reading it. It was a tough year for Mike's, but it really is, that stuck with me. And when I think about the fact that the vast majority of care, when you think about families, it's usually the woman in the family who is the CEO of healthcare for the family. So I think it's critically important that we continue to grow these leaders. Look, I will not take credit for the fact that 70% of GeneDx, our team is 70% women.
Yeah, wow.
I stepped in 3 years ago to a company that was founded by a woman, and there was already a massive team.
There's already a core culture there, and an ethos.
There was a core culture, but part of the reason why I wanted to make sure that I took this job was to create opportunities at every level for those who don't always have them, including women. So it's a personal passion of mine, for sure.
Love it. Well, Katherine, what you guys do at GeneDx is amazing work for people who really need it. And your work as a leader is obviously remarkable as well. So congrats on all the success. I really appreciate you coming on and educating our listeners about this fascinating field, this field that is going to, continue to make huge progress and huge difference in patients' lives, and also sharing your story. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to The Heart of Healthcare. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe. The Heart of Healthcare is produced by Hallie Tecco and hosted by Michael Esquivel, Steve Kraus, and Hallie Tecco. The show is engineered, edited, and mixed by Kyle Moore. Visit our website, heartofhealthcarepodcast.com, for show notes and details.